A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We are about to have a conversation about family and domestic violence in Australia. It appears to be a growing problem in our nation. Recent stats reveal that 1 in 4 women have experienced FDV, or family and domestic violence, since the age of 15. About 1 in 16 women have experienced violence since the age of 15 from a father, son, brother, or other male relative or in-law. 12% of people have witnessed partner violence against their mothers when they were children. 12%. So these stats are alarming, and it's hard to fathom that every number represents a person, a personal story, an experience of trauma, and the impacts of this on people's lives, their futures, their family, and even the shaping of their identity. So today, just a few days from the beginning of Families Week, we take the time to hear just one story of a brave woman who tells her story of being a survivor of family and domestic violence. And as always, you are open to join this conversation in about 15 minutes' time. And I'd also like to remind us that you can interact with us via several platforms today. You can text us on 0447 488 316. That's 0447 488 316. Or you can text us via our Vision Christian Media app. If you're listening through the app right now, there's an option there which says text in, and you can click on that and send us a message, or send us a message through our Facebook page or our Instagram page, or you can call us on the good old-fashioned dog and bone on the phone on 1-800-316. But before we start interacting with you, our listeners, I want to welcome a very special guest to the program today, and her name is Jeanine Hay. Jeanine, welcome.
Thank you.
Jeanine, it's great to have you on the program today. I read out those stats. What do you feel when you hear the statistics of family and domestic violence in Australia?
It is a reality that I've lived, and I very much feel empathetic toward those who suffer it, because there's a lot of people who feel bleak about their circumstances. They don't often think there's a hope out there that they can have their life turned around.
Yeah, so obviously you've experienced firsthand the impacts of family and domestic violence. Can you just tell us a little bit of your story, please, Jeanine?
Yeah, so I had grown up in a life of domestic violence. I was just born into it. My mum and dad were not married at the time I was conceived, and there was a conflict of values already at the very beginning. My mum had just come from New Zealand, and she was looking for a hope in Australia. And my mum met my dad, who was already in the drug scene. So that value base there was already a conflict. And I was conceived in that at the very beginning of my mum's entrance to Australia. Then I was born. A week after they got married, Mum met a Christian in Brisbane, and they said, "You need to get married." And so Mum said, "Well, let's do that." And my dad wasn't really into it. And that's where the brawling and the beginning of their unshared values created a lot of conflict, because Mum wanted to marry as a Christian and Dad wanted to run from the idea of that. He actually turned up on the wedding day drunk without a ring, and a Christian woman who was married took off her engagement and wedding ring and gave them to my mum on the day so the marriage could go ahead. And that was my mum's very sad way of starting a marriage and a future in Australia. And the rest really continued into my 4th and 5th year, where Mum and Dad had now had my sister. We'd moved to Melbourne. Dad had been involved with drugs. There were drug raids, and we even both had an overdose of drugs, and we wouldn't be taken to the hospital because that would disclose that they were taking drugs. We were neglected a lot. And Mum even lost us for a year because Dad took us for the welfare payments. So it was a very hard time, not just for us, but for Mum and Dad too, because they were finding their way, and it always seemed to undo them. Dad ended up in jail. Mum would get back on the horse and try and work a job to pay his debts off, and she just seemed lost until we were 5. We moved to Warrnambool, where Mum was bumped into the street by a Christian, and from the same church, from the same organisation as the one she had 5 years earlier. And they told her about Jesus again. And so Mum said, well, maybe this time I'll try it God's way.
Wow. Can I just ask you, you said you'd had a drug overdose. At what age had you had that drug overdose?
I was a toddler, and so was my sister. I took hash oil off a table that was a coffee table, and I was crawling up the walls for about 2 to 3 days, my mum said, and I just couldn't interact with reality because I was so affected by the hallucinogen aspect of that drug. And my sister had at the time heroin, which was also being cut on the coffee table. So this was within 6 to 12 months. And we weren't taken to the hospital.
Wow. How old was your sister when she took the heroin?
I think she was about 2 to 3 as well.
Just awful stuff. And like most kids, you just thought that was normal because that's all you knew. And you guys just soldiered on and just did your best. And is it fair to say, Jeanine, that often these things really come back to haunt people later in life when they have time to look back and process and just realise how traumatic events like that were?
Yeah, definitely, especially when I became a mother myself. Having 8 children and watching them go through those toddler years myself taught me a lot of lessons about how I had lacked, especially since I've had 4 and then I had another 4 with a gap in between. And I've raised my second lot of children very differently to what I did the first children.
Yeah, just awful. Jeanine, I got to say there is a bit of a crackle or a squeak in the audio. So we're going to take a short break now, and I just want to try and fix that. We're going to correct that. But if you're just joining us, this is Jeanine Hayes. She is a brave survivor of family and domestic violence, and we're really zeroing in on this area today. In about 10 minutes, we'll take your calls. You can also send us messages through our Facebook or Instagram pages or text us on 0447 488 316. That's 0447 488 316. And we're talking today about family and domestic violence here on Vision.
There are many ways people listen to Vision, including on Apple TV.
If you've got Apple TV at home, you can easily listen to Vision. Search for Vision Christian Radio or V180 Radio among the radio channels, and you'll be able to listen in crystal clear quality. You can also enjoy a growing range of Vision's on-demand podcasts using the Apple Podcasts app on Apple TV.
However and wherever you listen to Vision, you can be sure that the announcers, programs and music will help you look to God daily.
Sometimes it is difficult to set aside time for each other, but investing in your marriage will have a positive effect on your children, your work and your own personal health.
Hi, we're Brett and Kate Ryan from Focus on the Family Australia. In partnership with Vision Christian Media, we want to invite you to our Journey to Us marriage retreat, October 18th to the 20th in Melbourne.
We will be exploring how to build a God-honouring marriage you'll both love. For more details and to register, go to families.org.au.
Helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
I was lost at sea, no hope of being found. Waves crashing over me, rain pouring down. Thought I would sink, thought I would drown, hoping I'd be saved, but time was running out. And you are in control. That is all I need to know. When I'm feeling weak, I need you to rescue me. I need to know you're in control. Trying not to panic, I couldn't see the shore. So much further out than I'd even been before. Nothing I could hold, nowhere I could rest. No one else around me, just this beating in my chest. And you You are in control. That is all I need to know. When I'm feeling weak, I need you to rescue me. I need to know. I need to know. No, I'm looking for a lighthouse, looking for a way out of this mess. You're in control. You're in control. You are in control. That is all I need to know. When I'm feeling weak, I need you to rescue me. I need to know. I need to know. You're in control. You're in control. You're in control. You're in control. You're in control.
Levi McGrath singing You Are in Control here on Vision. Well, if you're just joining us, we are talking today about family and domestic violence. And as well as reading out some statistics I read out earlier, we're zeroing in on just one story, one of the many stories of a brave survivor of FDV or family or domestic violence. And I did read out some stats about domestic violence committed against women because our guest today is a female, but I appreciate someone has texted in and asked for the stats on domestic and family violence committed against men because their experiences are just as valid. And 1 in 14 men in Australia have experienced family or domestic violence. That's 693,000 men in Australia reporting that they are also the victims of family and domestic violence. So it's not just women that are suffering, men can also suffer in this space too. And we have a guest with us today. Her name is Jeanine Hay. And Jeanine, I think we've fixed our audio problem. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Great to have you back, Jeanine. So you were just telling us your story. So you grew up in a home which can really only be described as dysfunctional with drug and alcohol abuse in the home. You and your sister under the age of 10 had both taken illegal substances. There was violence in the home. Tell us what happened after that, Jeanine.
Yeah, not only did we experience just general neglect and being exposed to drugs and that kind of lifestyle, which was quite a frightening one as well. Some of the other events that had happened is our mum had been desperate to get a break and she'd left us with the next door neighbour who was a pedophile. So my sister and I experienced being interfered with for about 11 months or so by the neighbour. And this came to surface later on in my life. As you can imagine, I was quite young. And other things like having violence as well, because mum was very reactive. So she often disciplined excessively, which I experienced a lot of being hit from a young age. That was really unfair. It didn't make sense, which eventually affected me as well, as you could imagine. As well as mum and dad going through their issues, there was neglect. And our grandparents, fortunately, on our dad's side, lived in Melbourne as well. And so if we ever had a reprieve, it was because our grandparents were there. They were there to hold us and come and pick up the pieces, get dad on bail out of jail, just generally take care of us. And so we had what looked like, from the outside, it was sort of held together in a sense. So in a way, I felt like that was normal too as I went into school years.
Yeah, so man, it's pretty awful, your childhood experiences. So as you grew up as a teenager, was your thought or your feeling like, okay, well, that's what happened when I was a kid, but hey, I'm just going to get on with life now and I'm going to be happy and I'm just going to, function as a fairly functional adult? Was that kind of the feeling you had, or did you have a real sense of despondency and really a negative view of yourself and of the world?
A combination of both of those things, yeah, for sure. Because as I developed through high school, predominantly primary school, it began in grade 5, 6, I started to realise that Other people seemed to have coping skills that I didn't have. I didn't have the same resilience. I couldn't cope with stress of schoolwork. I couldn't focus. I did have that despondency. I didn't think very much of myself, and that really, I couldn't put it into words at that age. I was the kind of kid that was very quiet. I used to bump into furniture at my grandparents' house and apologise to it because I never knew where the next anxiety sort of provoking violent act from my mum might come. We were often hit without warning because mum was not coping well with her life either, and she had come from domestic violence, so it was really quite an entrenchment of my life. And it wasn't until I went into high school that it was becoming manifested in behaviour. I was a typical kid who rebelled. I didn't respect authority because authority hadn't been good to me generally. I wanted to connect. I was desperate to connect, but I couldn't understand why I was so awkward at it and socially dysfunctional. I had a huge issue with expressing my feelings because our mum was a detached mother, and my father was actually very loving. My memories of my father in my life were actually wonderful. I loved the way that my dad loved me and loved my sister, but he was also a very unavailable parent. He wasn't there when you needed him. He wasn't there to provide. But my memory of feeling around him was one of warmth, and it was a good thing. So when things transpired, my father died when I was 13. So this is where my teens really became quite problematic for me.
Oh, man. So did he die in a drug-related incident?
He did. He died in Adelaide, and 8 people died that week. It was 1999. And it wasn't until I became an adult that I did a bit of research into it to discover that in 1999 there were some of the biggest federal police raids across Australia, which removed a lot of the heroin off the market at that time. And so there was a lot of drug cutting that went on, a lot of things mixed into the heroin. And so my father was one of 8 people who died in Adelaide that week.
Oh, man, just awful. And do you remember the feelings you had when your dad died, or did you really harden yourself to it and just try and soldier on, or did you really grieve at that time?
It was a great miracle, actually, and it was actually my first experience of God touching me instantly. My mum was crying on the phone when we got home from school. She was talking to my dad's sister, and that's my auntie, who's told Mum that he's died. And we didn't know he'd actually been in a vegetative state for a couple of days to that point because the drugs had caused a stroke. So they knew in Adelaide, but they hadn't told us until the day he'd actually died. They'd turned the machine off. And so Mum was crying and we couldn't make sense of it. And then Mum just held the phone away and she said to us, "Your father's died." And you're like, what? Like, where's the support? Because you've gone straight back to the phone and you're crying with my auntie, but what are we supposed to do? Who's here to hold us? And so we both ran to our own bedrooms and jumped on our beds, having no way how to deal with it, and just cried into our pillows. And I remember being really angry and yelling into my pillow, and then I said out loud, "God, why is my dad dead? Why my dad? Why my dad? Like, my life isn't bad enough as it is. Why my dad?" And I had this still, quiet, small voice, just this knowing. And it was God saying to me, "Your dad is just as loved to me as you are, and you have the same choices that he had, free will. And the consequences that he's experiencing are because of the choices he made with that free will." And that was it. And there was a peace that came with it, and a knowing that this is how good God is and this is how he works. And a sort of like a call to action within me too, that I want to rise above that then. I want to use my free will to make better choices, that is not a consequence that I end up having in my life. That was it.
Isn't that amazing that in that one of the darkest moment in your life up until that time, that you just knew God was there and that he even spoke to you. And it's encouraging to know that even right now in the midst of trauma and tragedy all around the world, that God's always there for people, isn't he, Jeanine? That he never forsakes, he never leaves. And like the Bible says, he's a father to the fatherless.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to fast forward because I want to hear about your first really serious adult relationship, obviously forgetting school, high school romances and first boyfriends. But when you entered into your first real relationship as an adult, tell me how the impacts of your experiences as a child started to impact that relationship.
Yeah, so to stay streamlined to that point, I was 17 when I met at a Easter camp that the church was holding that we had grown up in from about the age of 5 at that point. And I had met this man who was 22 at the time, another member of youth, and he had wanted to kick the football. He seemed friendly. And when I look back on it now, I can see that because I had such a distortion of being able to identify what was a functioning relationship and a healthy dynamic between people, I realised that I was really, well, in a polite way to myself, I was lacking a lot of skills. And so I just saw him as an opportunity. Well, we're kicking the ball. We've got a few things in common. We're getting along well, you know. And so when he asked me to go out with him as a boyfriend-girlfriend dynamic in church, I didn't even really think about it. I just said, yeah, okay, why not? And I didn't know much about him. I honestly could say that. I didn't know anything really about him except he came from the Geelong youth group. So I didn't have anyone who knew him to talk to about him. And we were dating, I think, 6 weeks when he asked me to marry him. And at this stage, I'm pretty sure I may have been now 18, but it was a bit of a shock, as you can imagine, being asked to marry someone at 6 weeks. And I felt like I didn't have an option because I had grown up in a lifestyle where a lot of things weren't given to me as an option. They were take this or else, you know, this is what you have. If you don't like it, I'm not interested in how you feel. This is what I want for you, so deal with it. And so I just transferred those skills into any relationship that I had with people, and in this one.
So at the age of 18 then you were married. I'm guessing you guys got married pretty quick?
Yes. In fact, I came out of a church that had a ruling at the time. It was a Pentecostal church that if you had had any engagement with that person of any kind of intimate connection, that you would be kicked out of the church and then you would have to marry as well, because if you didn't, you would go to hell. Now, this really is this central sort of plumb line through all of my decision-making, really, from about the age of 10 to 12, is that plumb line of that church's ruling system, that dogmacy that went through the centre of it, because I actually went on to make some crazy decisions because I was in absolute fear that I was going to go to hell if I did not follow those rulings. Despite feeling in my heart they were not who the God was that had revealed himself to me, that's what I did. And so I did. I married him. Even though I bawled my eyes out on the morning of my wedding day and called my mum, and she said, Jeanine, don't worry, it's fine. We can just not go ahead with it. And I said, no, his parents have basically paid for it all. I feel like I have to. And so that was, the beginning of my marriage at 18. And 2 weeks later was the first time that he struck me.
Wow. But, and even before we get into that, so really you're experiencing religious trauma in the midst of all this as well, because that I would describe as religious trauma, that level of control and the way that particular church group was affecting your life. Like, that is legitimate trauma, isn't it?
It's really imperative that you actually point that out, because it's the reason that my mum stayed with my dad from the ages of 5 to 8 before they divorced, because my father was beating my mother, and I saw him nearly kill my mum on 2 different occasions because of those beatings, because she was told by the church, particularly an individual of that church, the pastor, that she had a responsibility to God to remain in that marriage until my dad was unfaithful. And he was already unfaithful, but you couldn't prove it. And so, yes, and it was not just limited to our family. It was happening with other married couples where there was a violent partner. And unfortunately, the case was in that isolated experience in that church, men who were perpetrating drugs and alcohol was, something that supported that. But there is also, and we will touch on this further on, this unhealthy combination is also the women that had their vulnerabilities coming in that made them susceptible and also co-contributed to those volatile combinations. That's from both my experience and from what I observed.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify. So I think my definition of control anyway is a church group. The Bible doesn't say that as Christian leaders we're supposed to control every aspect of people's lives. It's our job to equip the saints for the work of ministry. It's our job to encourage people in their spiritual walk and relationship with God. Sure, we can read out Bible verses which talk about lifestyle choices, but I think once a leader of a religious organization or the organization itself tries to control details of our lives, such as you need to stay in a marriage that's abusive or controlling, or, you're suffering, or, you can't do this job, but you can do that job. I think once churches or church leaders start meddling in our personal lives, I would define that as control. And I think the impacts of that, Jeanine, are religious trauma. And that's certainly what your family experienced.
I went on to continue it because I had grown through that. So I did the exact same thing in my marriage, and it's why I stayed in it for 11 years.
Yeah, so you said it was within how many weeks until you started to suffer domestic and family violence in your own marriage?
Yeah, just 2 weeks in. It began as a conversation, and he just asked me if I was going to transfer my bank details to him and make everything joint accounts now that we were married. And I made the informed and critical decision, having myself already completed an advanced diploma in accounting at TAFE and finished school early. And my mum had accounting skills as well, so I was quite competent with money and numbers. And I said to him, no, I don't want to do that. But when you can prove that you're more financially secure because you're about to go bankrupt, then I will reconsider where we can bring our finances together. And he said, that's what everybody does. Everybody does that. And he began to raise his voice at me. And he said, well, you have to do that because that's what married couples do. And I said, again, no, because I had a strong spirit and I was wanting to stand for what I really wanted to do. And so he turned around and punched me with his fist into my shoulder and then with both hands into my shoulders, and then sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands and said, I'm so sorry, I should never have treated you like that. And I would never do it again. But that just wasn't the case. It did continue.
And what was your first thought when he struck you like that? Were you thinking, this has to end, I need to leave this marriage? Or did you think it wasn't such a big deal? Like, what was going on then?
I wanted to leave. I didn't feel safe. I knew that it wasn't right how he had begun to speak to me. But there was this other part of me that was from a place of fear that if I don't put up with this, I'm going to go to hell forever. There's that, and if I separate and I get help, I'm going to be seen as someone who's undermining my husband. Getting help wasn't something I felt that church would support me with. And so I'd already seen that. They'd already demonstrated that with my mother. And so it was normalised. I'd become desensitized to that kind of level of physical altercation. And really, when you look at it on the spectrum of violence, that was nothing in the scheme of what I'd seen. I'd even seen police beat my dad up in my house when they've done drug raids and in front of my sister and I with guns involved. So, to see this event was, in one way, it was a non-event.
I also want to point out today, and I thank a couple of our listeners for their texts and their messages to us, that family and domestic violence also affects men. A lot of males don't report family or domestic violence. Some do. But over 680,000 men in Australia. I'm going to read that number again. 680,000 men in Australia have also reported family and domestic violence. So we can't just genderize this topic and say it's only women who are suffering. Men are suffering too. But today we are zeroing in on the story of one brave woman who is telling her story. But in the weeks ahead, we will find a male guest as well who's also been a victim of family and domestic violence and hear his story as well. But we need to remember when we hear these statistics that it's hard to fathom that every number represents a person, a personal story, an experience of trauma, and the impacts of this on their lives, their future, their family, and even the shaping of their identity. And so, as I said earlier, Jeanine Hay is joining us today. She is a survivor of family and domestic violence, and you are welcome to join the conversation now as well on 1-800-316-316. That's 1-800-316-316. Have you suffered family and domestic violence? Is there something you want to ask Jeanine about, or a comment you would like to make? I'd also like to remind us that you can text us today as well on 0447 488 316. That's 0447 488 316. Or if you're listening via the app, the Vision Christian Media app, there is an option on there which says text in. Click on that option and you can send us a text message as well. Or send us a message via Facebook or Instagram and we will try our best to read out that message as well. We want more engagement from our audience today. But as I said earlier, Jeanine Hay is our very special guest here on 2020. And Jeanine, I want to welcome you back to 2020 today.
Thank you.
So Jeanine, we were just saying that you were just a few weeks into your marriage and you already started to experience domestic violence from your own partner. You're only 18 years old. And in the background, you had a church group that was basically saying to you, you can't leave a marriage, even if it's abusive, because if you do, you'll go to hell, which is just awful, awful, awful. It's theologically wrong. It's controlling, and I would describe that as religious trauma, which is a very real thing in Australia and most of the Western world as well. But before we continue on your story, Jeanine, we do have one gentleman who's called in who wants to make a comment. His name is Jonathan. He's calling in from Melbourne, Victoria. Jonathan, welcome to the program.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, mate. Have you got a comment or a question for Jeanine today?
I've got a comment on the topic that I believe the issue of pornography ties into this in some way, even though it's complex, and parents need to be protecting their kids and teens from that.
Absolutely. Jeanine, have you got a response to that as well?
Sorry, the reference to pornography playing into domestic violence? Or just that children need to be protected from it?
For me, I think in terms of some situations of domestic violence, it could be a contributing factor.
Yeah, sure. So I didn't experience that with my parents. And I guess you have to look at the era too. It wasn't so readily available with technology at the time. But I did experience it when the pedophile who lived next door, VHSs were always put on the TV. And it's an interesting point that you make because it actually went on in my teens to become an issue for me because I didn't realise that all of these videos and things were going to actually pop up in my mind again, which I then went on to get, well, I did. I spent a lot of extensive time in therapy trying to get a better, healthy vision and version of what intimacy should look like.
Can I ask, Jonathan, how do you believe that pornography impacts this area of family domestic violence? What do you think the link is?
From what I've heard, online pornography can contain violent content, and if teenagers are experiencing that, it might form the way they think about how to treat people.
Yeah, I actually think that's a very valid point because pornography objectifies the people involved and women in particular. And I think it does. It causes a hardening of the heart, especially for young males towards women when they just view them as nothing more than sex objects. And there isn't a respect for them, for their dignity or their welfare or their value as individuals. And I actually think, Jonathan, you make a really valid point there. And not to mention, like you said, the pornography, which contains a lot of violence now towards people in those acts that are depicted on those movies that they make. I think that also just causes a real hardening of people's hearts towards each other, and they get into intimate relationships with other people, and there isn't that respect and there isn't that honour or that dignity towards each other. I think it's a valid point, Jonathan, that it can lead to, sadly, to violence within intimate relationships.
Yeah, and I think there are tools parents can use, such as filters like Covenant Eyes, which can protect their kids, and exposure starts at a young age, so I think that's important to get onto. Yeah,
hey, really appreciate the call. Jeanine, have you got a response or something you want to add to the conversation with Jonathan right now as well?
Yeah, I think thank you for offering, actually, because as you mentioned about how men's hearts can harden toward women, I've also experienced, and even one of my partners experienced it, where women can become objectifying of men as well, as they see them as just something that's going to meet their need. And it doesn't just pertain to the bedroom in that sense, but it can also expand out into other attitudes in their life of just, objectifying men. And this can also, too, create conflict between, obviously, that resentment that grows and feeling like we're not loved, we're not appreciated, we're not valued. And anyone who's in a situation like that can tend to become defensive and protective and withdraw, which creates further disconnection.
Very, very valid stuff. And Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for calling us on 2020 today.
Thank you.
And Jeanine, let's get back to your story. So you're in this situation now where you kind of thinking maybe we need to leave the relationship, but you don't leave because you're being told you'll go to hell if you leave. So what happens next?
Look, religious control, or that word to it, it really did traumatise me, and it went on for quite some time, well over a decade. I would say I've only really recovered in the last 6 years. It took me almost my whole life to make sense of and reframe who God truly is. And that's come from a walking with God, and as God reveals himself to me, separate to the beliefs and the system that I had grown up in. So unfortunately, I did grow up and stay in that marriage, in the case of having 4 children within that marriage. And I did not learn to stand for myself in it, because there was also very strong religious constraint that, not saying the church was advocating, but my husband was definitely demonstrating. And because I had that fear that if I was to step out of line or reach out for help, that I was going to suffer consequences, and eternal ones. You know, that's the greatest fear you could possibly ever have. I was not able to step out of that marriage in that time.
And did the abuse continue for the whole time you're in the marriage, the physical abuse?
It did for 2 years, and it gradually escalated over that 2 years. As when I look back on it now, I can see that with all of my fears and my inability to stand up for what I believed was correct for me, and that's got nothing to do with my husband at the time. That was my own brokenness from my own development in childhood. So I was unable to keep standing and asserting myself, which meant that I stayed in that environment. And for my husband, as I got to learn his parents' behaviour, I realised that he himself was also struggling. He was handed a pretty bad deck of cards there, a bad hand, should I say. And I realised then that I actually didn't have the skills. I didn't have the skills to have a healthy relationship. So, you know, who am I to point the finger? So it took 2 years of fighting, and then I asked God for a result, for some way to deal with this at church one day. And during this time, my husband was actually ministering. He was, he was very well regarded in our church, and nobody really knew about any of this stuff that was happening at home. And that was a face that nobody saw of him or myself, and that fighting that was going on. So it was a guilt as well. There was a shame that I was carrying. It was very heavy on me, and I imagine it was very heavy on him. We've never gone on to have conversations about this, but I can only imagine it was as heavy for him as it was for me, because we knew the truth and we knew that God knew the truth.
Yeah, and so you eventually got the courage up to end the marriage.
Yeah, it was quite a journey. So the last nearly 9 years of our relationship was not so much physical violence, it was more emotional manipulation, because it had come to a point where my husband and I had been in a fight. I was trying to leave at that 2.5-year mark of marriage, and he used force against me. And it went on for about an hour. It was like something you would see in a really awful domestic violence scene in a movie. It involved me being ripped out of the shower and me trying to grab the baby and leave. I was heavily pregnant. I was about 7 months, so I had a big bump. And I was willing to run out of the house with no clothes on with my baby at the time, who was just over 1, and run out with no clothes on. And I went to open up the door, and it was like a horror scene, because I was just about to turn the handle and rip it open, and the safety chain at the top of the door was on. And when I went to open it, he grabbed me, he slammed the door because it wouldn't open, and he threw our baby in the cot from about 1 metre away from the cot. He was about 1, and then threw me on the ground. And I became enraged, because I felt like an imprisoned animal. Now I felt like I was being detained as a human who had rights, and I really wanted to get out now. And he pinned me down on the bed, and he had his hands around my throat, and it was one of the most physically terrifying experiences that I've had, because I've never been treated like this before up until this point, and not since then, thankfully. And I actually remembered a movie I'd seen where someone poked them in the eye with their knuckle, and that's what I did to get him off me. And I ran to my baby, and this time when he went to hit me, I hit him at the same time and broke my wrist instantly. It smashed, and I was immediately rendered disempowered. I couldn't do anything, and I actually walked into the kitchen because he would stand in the doorway and would not let me get to my screaming baby. He knew that he had defeated me, and I laid on the kitchen tiled floor like a wounded lion, and I just wet myself. I literally urinated on the floor, cried myself to sleep, sobbing, and I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning in the craziest pain. And that, in my mind, solidified I can't leave. Not only can I not leave mentally because I'll go to hell, but I actually physically cannot leave, or what could happen next? I could die next time. And so I stayed in it for 9 years. And it was this time I went to the pastor and I told him he'd broken my wrist. I didn't tell him the rest of the story. I just thought, well, it's already embarrassing enough that, my life is a mess. And he talked to my husband the same day and said, if you lay a hand on her again, I will send you to the police station. And so from there, I didn't go to the hospital. My husband wouldn't let me go, and because that would involve me reporting it. And so at this stage, I'm very young. I think I'm about 22 nearly. And my mum is not sure how to help me either, because she lived domestic violence. And she said to me that she felt just as responsible because she grew me up in it. So she didn't know how to help me. And she also didn't want to tell me to leave because she didn't want me to go to hell. So that religious control came in again. And then at that point, I stayed in it. So the children didn't get hit anymore until they were about 4 or 5, and they had a voice for themselves. And so my husband stopped hitting me, but he became violent toward his children. And, empathetically, in consideration of my husband at the time, he didn't get any help. He was always offered. And I think his shame, I think that baggage of shame is what really stopped him from being able to get help. And so eventually my husband threatened to take the children away from me if I left him. I began to get empowered in the 8th and 9th year of marriage. And I was sort of getting out in the community a little bit. And he said to me, if you leave, I'm going to take the children. And then my mother died. And she was the only person who knew about the violence at home to the extent that it was. And I felt trapped. And I decided that the baby that I was now pregnant with was not going to live domestic violence. It was a decision I made, like when we follow God, it's a decision. And at that time, I committed to it, and I started going to a counsellor, and I told them just little bits and little bits and little bits. And about a year later, the police removed us from the home in an undercover operation because my husband had threatened to kill the 4 children if I left him. That's what he was saying to me privately. And so, the police came and took us undercover, and they arranged it prior to it. They would come to my counselling appointments, and my husband would think he was just dropping me off for counselling. So it actually became very serious, and one of the worst cases that they had in South Australia at the time.
Wow, there's so much to that story, and I think the word trapped is the best one that you've used there just to describe the situation you were in. And Jeanine, I just want to hold that story right there because we do have another caller, Adam from Mary. It's Maryville, I think it's called. Marysville in Victoria has called in. Adam, are you there?
Yes.
Have you got a comment or a question for Jeanine today?
Yes, I was just wondering what your personal opinion would be with some of the music videos out there these days, because some of them seem to be very highly charged with sexual content.
Yeah, and are you asking if there's a link to family domestic violence through the music videos as well as the...
Like Britney Spears and Taylor Swift.
Yeah. Jeanine, have you got a response to that? Do you think that the modern music culture, and let's be fair, there's a lot of that sort of rap music today, it's very demeaning towards women. The terms they use to describe women are just awful. Do you think there is a link between that and, once again, that lack of respect and that hardening of the male heart towards women today?
Yeah, thank you. That really did give me a bit of a chuckle, actually, Adam, because I've got teenagers and I personally don't watch music videos, at least not that kind. And my children like to give me feedback on what they're seeing and what is coming out. And we do have conversations about it. We talk a lot about how where God is and where God needs to be more of. And yeah, the video clip can be geared toward desensitizing, and this is my opinion. Thank you for asking. It desensitizes the children, the teenagers, and the adults that put them up and watch them. And to the point, one of my children told me that at school it's not uncommon for them, and this is this year, to put music videos on. And I was actually really surprised that, taking away from Britney Spears and Taylor Swift, that this was actually a video clip that's already geared toward children. It's got billions of views on YouTube. And the character that's dancing in the video, which is animated, is actually doing sexually connotated dance moves, which has just become acceptable and normal. And I think that because we do in our family focus on the revelation of life at the moment, we like to remind ourselves that we were expecting to see that the good would appear evil and the evil would appear good. And so we try to protect ourselves from it, but we also try to look at it in a way that a lot of people who do what they do and post what they post, and these companies who release what they release, may not be thinking about the audience in that way. Their minds are not particularly geared that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And Adam, I want to thank you so much for calling in today. And I think it's a very valid point you make. It's the spirit of the world, like you said, which is in music, it's in movies, it's in mass entertainment. That spirit of the world is really what is helping to destroy people's relationships and sadly even families today. So Adam, thanks for the call today.
Mm.
And, you know, I think it raises an interesting point, Jeanine, that you look back in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, before Noah's Ark, the Bible says that there was, next level immorality, that the sons of God were actually, sleeping with the daughters of men. So there was immorality everywhere. But it also says the earth was filled with violence. And I think we can draw from that violence and sexual immorality actually do have a link. And when people are engaged in watching pornography or even just, listening to heaps of modern day music, which is really demeaning about women, it's very demeaning about sexual relationships. It's not encouraging sexual relationships within a marriage, that's for sure. I think it shouldn't be a surprise to us that violence is on the rise as well, from men towards women, and not even in intimate relationships. I mean, we're seeing nurses get assaulted in hospitals now by disgruntled patients. Like, my mum was a nurse, and she grew up with nurses and, visiting us all the time. Her friends were nurses, and you never heard about this stuff 30 years ago. And yet today there are men out there who will actually strike out at a woman who's a nurse in a hospital who they don't even know, because they're frustrated. And I just think that's just the spirit of the world today, which is just destructive. And it does sadly include violence, doesn't it, Jeanine?
Mm.
But Jeanine, I also want to just get to the positive part of your story. We've got a few more minutes. How did you get free, not just free in a physical sense, but what steps can our listeners take away from your story today, Jeanine? How did you find real freedom and real wholeness in your own soul after all the trauma that you've experienced?
Well, God is obviously the answer there, and because like we've just heard from those two callers, it's not in the world that we're going to find our peace nor our answers, nor is it going to be the way that through those principles shall it repair anything and restore anyone. It's God and his principles. And, coming out of a church that had taught me the way that it had, coming out of the marriage that I had learnt what I had, I'd experienced it as a young person and then also gone into it. It was me reaching out in my desperation. When we get to that point where we say to ourselves, I don't want this for myself anymore, and I don't have the answers, and I don't know. And when I came out of that marriage, it wasn't long after that I met a couple who became like my parents. I'd met them randomly through a neighbour they were looking for work on their property, and I happened to have a landscaping background with my husband, and I began being the caretaker of a public gardens, and they were Christian, and David was in his 90s, and he had served in World War II, and he was a wonderful God-fearing man, and they loved me. They loved me like the love of God. They really healed my heart, and they showed me what the true church of God was, and that was a relationship with God from within us, that we are the temple. And they showed me who God was through their acts of kindness. And though it went on to continue to be a problem for me in my life, and this is going back to 2013, It's been over 10 years now, and that journey has led me to many advancements in my progression of healed and functional relationship. I've done courses. I'm certified in attachment theory, and I'm certified in trauma-informed care, and I've gone on to do those things because I wanted to help my children heal, and I wanted to help myself heal. And I repeated a few more mistakes after that with another partner. But what I learned at the end, what God spoke to me is, I'm responsible for my relationship with God and being his reflection on this earth, and that it's not about blaming anybody. And he healed me in miraculous ways. He's literally deposited this unconditional love into me, and it is miraculous what has happened to me. And 2021, I had an experience where I thought I was through it. I thought I was having a great life with the kids, and I was on my way home when, and I mean that metaphorically, when I was becoming a bit despondent. It was already during COVID, and I wasn't sure what God had planned for me. And I remember saying to God, what's my purpose? Like, when are you going to show, have I got a purpose? Because I'd read the book, The Purpose Driven. Like, what is mine? I don't know what it is, because I just seem to have a life of dysfunction that has preceded me. And I've gone to bed one day, and I woke up, and I didn't actually wake what I usually would do. I was asleep, and I had this booming voice that came from within me that said in this big male tone, Jeanine, it's time for me, well, it's time for you. Jeanine, it's time for you to stand up and be that which I created you for and serve my purpose. And when I heard it, I jumped up out of bed and I ran around because I swore someone had spoken, and it was that invigorating. It just blew up my spirit, and I just didn't know what was happening. And I was filled with unconditional love. And from that point, I started having a whole new level of relationship. I understood that there was two sides of the coin, that men and women both need support, that despite what you've grown up with, despite what you've experienced, that God actually wants to redeem all of us, and he wants to unite us again. And he wants us to not live in the story of victimhood and the division and stop looking at who did what to who. He wants us to take responsibility for ourselves and come back together under his banner of love and under his son, who is the Lord of all of us. And
amen. Wonderful, wonderful. I just want to say, Jeanine, I love how your story ends there with a really positive relationship you formed in a church with a beautiful couple who just loved you, and that was part of your journey, because we can't do these things alone, Kemal. We can't do it on our own. And I also love the way that you said in different parts of your journey too, you've encountered God along the way and found wholeness and healing. And I just want to point out to our listeners too, Jeanine actually came to my attention as a caller on this show a couple of months ago. She called in and just had such a riveting story. I wanted to hear her story in more depth. And we could go on for another half an hour, Jeanine, but we've actually got to move on with the show. We've got another segment coming up. But you'll be doing a podcast which is coming out in a few months' time. What's the name of the podcast?
At the moment, it's going to be Project Podcast, and then we'll have the title according to what God inspires. And it's going to be about us teaching everyone else and others how God starts the work from within, and that he can actually bring us into his greatest potential and turn whatever we've lived in life into a glory to him. Yeah,
wonderful. Well, we look out for that one, and let us know when it actually is released. But Jeanine Hay, a survivor of family and domestic violence who's really found some light at the end of the tunnel that you've walked down in life, I want to thank you so much for bearing your soul and telling us your story on 2020 Today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.